Ladies and gentlemen, it is February 15th, 2026, and we are here to talk about the world, current events, foreign policy, economics, you name it, we'll talk about it in another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Hello.
Yo.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing well, how are you?
Fat and sassy.
Status quo.
Pretty much.
Nice. I got to do something a bit unusual this past week. I did a 21-hour stream just because it was a Twitch partner anniversary. I think it's 11 years we've been Twitch partnered. So, pretty cool. We just kept going. My energy was good. We did a really long stream. And then I slept a bunch. And between catching up with rest over the next 2 days, I watched all of Gen V season 1 and 2. So I got to go through a TV show, which I don't often do. Normally, I'm just booking most of my time to have more stream up time. So I'm playing a bunch of games and I'm live streaming. But watching TV shows is not really in the rotation. And that was fun. Just go all the way through 2 seasons in a couple days. It's very good. If you like The Boys, you will like that as well. I think I like it more because I like the characters more, and it has a little bit less cringe. The Boys has a lot of social situations. It's a dystopian superhero universe for people who don't know what I'm talking about. Basically, there's a pharmaceutical company called Vought that gives people a drug called Compound V that can cause people to either die or manifest superhero powers of some kind. But the powers you get are very random. Some of them are very strong, some of them are very weak, and people's power levels vary dramatically as well. So it's a cool setting for a superhero narrative. And it's a lot more realistic in the sense of many humans would abuse these powers and be villainous rather than righteous superheroes. Like Marvel and DC superheroes are across the board a lot more morally solid and good, at least how they're written. There are certain anti-heroes as well, but compared to the average human's behavior, it's a very positive reflection of what superheroes would be, and then the darkness is reflected in the villains. Whereas with this show, it's much more realistic of you're a person who was drugged up with this compound, you grow up having to deal with the differences of your body compared to everybody else, and then just also trying to make a living and also manage your social image. So there's a lot of using information against other characters as a way to get leverage in a situation rather than necessarily being the most powerful. Because oftentimes a character that's less powerful has social leverage on the character that's more powerful, therefore they have the advantage. And that can be used by good characters or bad characters. So it's got good character interactions, interesting commentary. Gen V was more enjoyable for me, I think, just in terms of the tones and less of the cringe of The Boys. But both of them are very gory. You should be mentally prepared for characters that you become attached to explode spontaneously in just like a pile of guts, which is more directly violent than a lot of film. A lot of film will like do cutaways whenever the actual violent part is happening, whereas this one is just like almost comical Tarantino levels of characters dying. So it can be abrupt and upsetting in that sense, but very fun.
Well, that sums up a lot of media in the 2020s now, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Who would have thought the future would be so edgy?
Yeah, I think there's a general trend of content getting louder in whatever way that it can, doing things in a more extreme manner, like to the point that it's past realism and it's hyper realism. It's just more of the same types of excitement that you can think of in any category. This could be music as well. I think music is louder for the average volume across the song, and there's less variation in softer parts just because that it sells better. It's more marketable, it's more immediately catchy, and it's more like constant stimulation of more sound over time. So some things to be aware of with the trends, but I thought Gen V was really good. Definitely got me invested, and the cameos of characters from the other show, The Boys, was pretty amusing when that would happen. Good acting, good characters. And a funny thing I was noticing, like probably 2 episodes in, is like almost all of the main characters are extremely good looking. There are different types of people for sure, but they're all attractive in some way, or they carry themselves really well. So they did a really good job with casting of the show, I think, of people who are, instead of grizzled, grumpy adults, which is what The Boys is, these are college students who are all motivated and driven in some way to be better superheroes and join the superhero college. But then they all just happen to be really hot, just randomly. So, and that's not addressed throughout the show. I just feel like it's kind of funny when you have casting that makes everyone look really good. But it kind of fits with, I guess, their the philosophy of the company is very much do whatever works without much moral consideration. That's the pharmaceutical company's MO. They're not really trying to save society or lower crime. There's no like moral objective. It's simply money and profit. And they'll kind of steer the heroes in whatever direction does so for them, which ends up making them more like celebrity props that are worshipped rather than actual crime fighters or actual military units. There's almost no organized practical institution that administers superheroes in like a police force or anything. That's feasible, and that's done in some other stuff like My Hero Academia is basically that. What if you had institutions that were able to organize the superheroes that you had and like relegate tasks to them, community service, things of this nature. But The Boys is more so, what if that power was not a morally good police administration? What if it was a for-profit entertainment company and pharmaceutical company? So very good. I would give it a high score.
I'll take a look.
Yeah. The Dodo grind continues. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, whenever people bring up VOT in relation to The Boys, it kind of throws me because there actually was a company called VOT at one point.
And what did they do?
They made airplanes, specifically for the U.S. military. I believe it was the F-8 Crusader and the A-7 Corsair. Both of which were pretty good planes, from
And
everything I've heard about them.
With cool names as well.
Yeah, I feel like they were a little better at naming them back in the day. But to be fair, they had more opportunities. Development cycles for new aircraft were much shorter back then.
There isn't as much of an emotional activation whenever you say a name of a plane that's just a letter and numbers. Like an F-15. It's like, for someone who doesn't know planes, they don't feel anything about that. But the A-10 Warthog, it's like, Warthog? That sounds really tough. What does that do?
Yeah. Yeah, it's easier to remember. Much more striking imagery. And you have some kind of name you can attach to the aircraft.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then with the Warthog, you not only have the name, you have the sound that's iconic.
Yeah, the Gatling gun.
Yep.
Everybody loves the Gatling gun.
There was a heckin' discussion in like a Marvel subreddit about superheroes, and they were like, could Thanos' army be stopped by the militaries of Earth if they work together? And people in the comments were like, just get a bunch of A-10 Warthogs and clear the whole ground army. It's super easy. Two of those things.
Yep. Probably should have been retired by now. It's a little past its sell-by date, but people won't let it die.
When is that one from?
What is what from?
The Warthog?
Yeah.
What year-ish?
Oh, what year was it introduced? I want to say early mid-70s. If I'm not mistaken. Let's check with Dr. Wikipedia. Because I don't remember the exact year off the top of my head.
SR-71 Blackbird is goated? Yes. I had a model of that one.
77.
Oh, nice. Yeah, that's old at this point. That's super old. Holy shit.
Well, most aircraft are pretty old at this point because since the Cold War ended, there hasn't been as much impetus to develop, better, faster models. So they
Mm-hmm.
mostly just try to, what's the word I want? They do block upgrades for existing aircraft so that they can extend the life cycle, useful life rather. So that's sort of the cheaper alternative to just developing a whole list of new aircraft.
Well, they could do it kind of
Obviously,
like a computer, right? Where you leave the frame and most of the like base materials of the outer part of it, but you update the computer work. Because I feel like the consoles and the stuff that the pilot is interacting with would want to be updated the most, and then probably your guns.
yeah, the avionics get updated for sure. That's definitely part of the block upgrades, but they will actually sometimes upgrade the frame as well.
Hmm.
Sometimes they can reduce the maintenance costs, improve performance, or sometimes they just need to replace shit.
Mm-hmm.
Old frames can have problems. Sometimes you got to change them.
Mm-hmm.
And engines too. Sometimes they'll replace the engines with newer models that are more efficient, or uh, just to replace older models that are kind of getting run down. But yeah, the bigger issue with the A10 is not so much the age, but just the fact that its role is kind of redundant at this point. It was very much designed to negate the Soviet advantage in armor in a hypothetical Third World War in Europe.
Hmm.
And that's not really a problem anymore. So why then do we still have them?
Mm-hmm.
I think the main argument is that it's very good at close air support, but that's a role that pretty much any aircraft can do. It doesn't necessarily have to be the A10.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of argumentation about it. But it's got a lot of fanboys, and they generally have enough political sway in Washington to stop Congress from forcing the military to drop them.
Hmm.
So they're still hanging around.
That's funny.
I mean, given how cool it is, maybe there's something to be said for just having it around for media purposes.
Yeah, if it makes people more friendly to supporting military research and stuff, then you can use it basically as a marketing tool.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah, planes are awesome. I didn't really see, just kind of addressing more of the IRL of recent news. Nothing super of note for me aside from like dumb shit about Olympic cheating and curling and yelling Canadians and so on. It's about as far
Yeah.
as I got for banter of what reached me. There's always more Epstein stuff, and someone's going to ask eventually during this segment because that's like a normal thing, but there are, I guess, hearings or something that are consistently ongoing and more files get released over time. I don't know how that whole thing works, but the people who are about the outcome of that are very about it. And it does seem like there's a fairly large amount of information there. Like someone has access to it. There's a fairly large amount of information, and it's going to make people look bad. Like that's what it is.
Mm.
What it changes with actual seats in power, like that's a question mark, and I think that's where you've said you don't think that much is going to come of it in terms of the power shifting around because of people's consequences. But it can make people look bad. Like people get semi-canceled when it finds out that you were close with this group of people, you went to this place where a lot of bad stuff was happening. Regardless of what is actually pursued toward you, it makes you look ugly in a certain way, which is good. Like
Yeah.
that's a form of accountability. But yeah, a lot of people, like for example, they want Trump to be in big trouble from that, and maybe he gets kicked out of office. Like that would be a good outcome for some people from their perspective. But yeah, I don't know how the whole process is of what information is disclosed to the public versus what is still withheld, and then who has eyes on the most complete versions of stuff.
Well, what happened recently is that there was a big new drop of information. The government released a whole shit ton of files that they had not previously released, and it's the single largest release yet. And so that's led to a lot more discussion about it, since people have been kind of filtering through all the different files, the emails, etc., and trying to make connections, basically, trying to do their own little mini investigations. You'd think people would learn by now that the general public is really terrible at this, but it doesn't seem to matter. So there's been any number of new conspiracy theories that have come out of it. I think I saw somebody talking about cannibalism recently. The Bank of Ball. It's just, there's always some new dumb shit coming out of it. The more I hear about it, the less seriously I take it. I was already inclined to think that the Epstein files were not going to go anywhere, but the dumber the conspiracy theories get, the less serious I think people are going to take the whole issue.
Do you know if there was any Sharon involvement?
Any what?
Sharon involvement?
Oh. No.
Okay.
Not to my knowledge. No, alas, there is a despairing lack of sexy statues.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I hope that justice is meted out appropriately to situations and so on. It's very nasty what happened to a lot of the victims of this very evil operation, so I completely understand people's anger around this and their desire for justice. So that all makes complete sense, and I hope for the best outcome possible. But pretty crazy shit. Like, crazy out of left field, socially nasty things that connected to people's, individuals of power, because it was on a fucking fancy island, which I guess is expensive. So you have a pretty major barrier to this kind of operation. But as you've said before, there are other forms of, like, human rights abuses and trafficking that exist. This is just one example of that, but it's a very high profile example that's also a very kind of larger scale systematic thing, as opposed to, like, local town, someone gets kidnapped and then used for whatever ill purpose.
Well, the scope of Epstein's operation is still, I think, up for debate. I haven't seen any evidence that it was part of, like, a broader international conspiracy. It seems like he and, God, what's her name? Maxwell, I think her name is, mostly just ran it themselves. And there could be new evidence that comes out that disproves that, but if there is, I haven't seen it. Evil tends to be banal. The most dramatic explanations generally are overwrought.
Yeah, like, the theory behind it might not be some satanic cult, for example. It could just be they were both very, very, very bad people who wanted to make money and control people of power and had almost no moral scruples to speak of. So that allowed them to do one of the nastiest operations that's been thusly discovered. Pretty crazy. But yeah, that's something that'll develop. People don't like the Attorney General lady, or at least people who want justice about this, because she's...
Oh, Pam Bondi.
Yeah. Yeah.
She got in trouble the past week. What was it? She was getting asked about the Epstein files again, and she made some offhand comment about how people need to move on, and they need to focus more on the fact that the Dow is over 50K.
Yeah, I heard about that.
Yeah. Like, oh man, is that ever not gonna work?
Guys, don't be angry about the things happening in your country. The Seahawks won. They won the Super Bowl. It's like, oh shit, you're right. Well,
we'll see what comes of it, but I'm generally pessimistic about the whole thing. So we'll see. But yeah, I don't really have any big updates here. No more than what we already had anyway. I had a hard time trying to find stories for the notes, from my notes rather, because it was just so full of stuff on the early 19th century. I should probably create a separate file for those. I found an interesting story from the War of 1812. There's lots of random trivia, and I won't do that when we actually kind of go through and do the whole thing, basically, go through the whole era. But there's a couple trivia stories that I thought were interesting. One of them was the guy who was in charge of Fort McKiniac, I think it was called. Basically, it was a fort that was at the northern tip of Michigan, or at least the eastern peninsula of Michigan. And I forget his name, but the officer in charge had not been informed that the United States was going to war, or that it was at war after the declaration was made. And so he had no idea what was going on. And the first time he found out about it was when the British attacked his fort. Like, just the government totally neglected to inform this guy that he needed to prepare. So he's caught completely off guard, and he ends up having to surrender the fort because there's basically just nothing he can do. The British actually let him and his men go in exchange for he and his men signing an agreement not to take up arms again in the conflict. Honor code type stuff like that was much more normal in that period of warfare. So not too surprising, albeit a little unusual by modern standards. So he goes back to, I don't remember exactly where it's, I think Erie, Ohio, I think was the other main American redoubt in the region. And while he's there, he of course has to report back what happened. And the military completely throws this guy under the bus. They blame him for the surrender of the fort, and they accuse him of cowardice, which is grossly unfair to him. It's not his fault. But they said, no, you surrendered the fort, you're a coward, we're going to court-martial you. And they actually start the proceedings. And then it gets worse. This guy is he's standing in the fort, right? Where they're having, the court martial and whatnot, where he's basically being interned. And while he's there, the British attack. And a cannonball fired from a British ship goes through the fort wall and cuts him in half.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah. So he dies instantly. So talk about bad luck. The military feels sorry for him, ends up renaming the base he surrendered after him.
Wow.
Yeah, that guy was born under an unlucky star. Let's see, I think last week somebody was asking about Somalia and Turkey. And I hadn't read anything about any new developments there, so after the stream I looked it up. And apparently Turkey did send some F-16s to Somalia. When I say send, I don't mean sell. Like, they're sending their own F-16s, and they're going to be stationed in Somalia, apparently to provide air support to the Somali army, I guess, which is a thing, apparently. I don't... If Somalia has an army, it's a nascent one. Because I haven't read that they've really been building one. They've been relying pretty heavily on a combination of foreign support and local militias. But in so much as Somalia has an army, they now have at least some air support available to them. I don't think I would really change my answer from last week too much, though. I still think it's mostly just Erdogan being opportunistic. That's very much his style.
Mm.
And I don't think there's a whole lot for him to gain there other than just building relations with local elites. One angle I didn't think of, which was in the article I read about this, is that recently, a couple weeks ago, Israel had recognized the independence of Somaliland,
Mm-hmm.
which is a breakaway republic that had been part of Somalia, and which the UN recognized Somali government still claims. And the Turkish government says that it doesn't like that. I don't know how genuine they're really being in that, but they say that it was wrong for Israel to do that, and that they believe that the territorial integrity of Somalia should be respected. And they partly justified their deployment of the F-16s in that vein. That was apparently, in part, their way of snubbing Israel and their recognition of the independence of Somaliland. So Turkey may be making a move here to try to underline the international norm in favor of territorial integrity. That's been a big part of the foundation of international law for much of the past, let's say, 70 years, basically since World War II ended. In general, it is assumed that states should not be allowed to break apart unless there is some very formal legal process by which it is done, in which all parties involved consent. The bar is relatively high, in other words. So for countries to recognize the independence of Somaliland, it does somewhat breach that norm.
Mm-hmm.
And Turkey has its own problem with a part of its territory that wants to break away, specifically the southeast, which is heavily populated with ethnic Kurds who don't really think of themselves as ethnic Turks, in contrast to what the Turkish government insists. So the Turkish government does have a vested interest in maintaining this norm against separatism. But again, I don't really think that's the actual motive here. It's not as though the Turkish government has a big problem with supporting factions or groups, what have you, that want to overthrow established governments or separate from them. They've had no problem supporting rebels in Syria or the Tripoli faction in the Libyan civil war, or for that matter, intervening in Cyprus and breaking away northern Cyprus into a new state. So there's more than a little bit of hypocrisy in them whining about this, is the point I'm getting at. So I suspect it's just Erdogan looking for deals. That's just the way he approaches foreign policy. He wants to find opportunities by building relations with other leaders in other countries. Maybe it doesn't end up going anywhere, but he has kind of a businessman's mindset. You don't really know for sure until you try. To be fair to Erdogan, that's not something that is exclusive to him. That is kind of normal in the broader region. The Middle East is loaded with despots, kings, what have you, basically authoritarian leaders of one sort or another who run their countries like their personal fiefdoms. Erdogan is not quite that powerful, but he runs a de facto one-party state. So he's kind of in the same league, roughly speaking. He's more illiberal democracy. He leads what it would be classified more as an illiberal democracy than an authoritarian state. But
Is
his
he
approach
seen
to politics.
favorably in Turkey?
Sorry, what?
Is he seen favorably by his people?
That very much depends on who you ask. That question is a good way to start an argument in Turkey.
Mm.
Yeah, there's a lot of strong feelings both for and against Erdogan. I would point out that he used to be much more popular, now less so. his star is kind of waning, as well as that of his party, the AKP. But he still has strong supporters. Although I don't know that that support really stems from performance or ideology so much as just patronage. Turkish politics is loaded with corruption and patronage, so so long as he pays his patrons on time, they're going to be loyal, and he still does. In so much as he's losing support, it's more because of money issues, inflation, economic underperformance, all of which makes it relatively difficult for the government to maintain extended patronage networks. And there's also been, issues, so to speak. The big earthquake, what was it, a year or two ago? That didn't help. Again, general economic malaise, losing Istanbul. There's kind of a chicken and egg argument there. Did he lose Istanbul because he's getting unpopular? Or did the loss of Istanbul contribute to his decline in popularity? Kind of both are true. I think both have truth to them. The decline contributed to the loss of Istanbul, but the loss of Istanbul also showed people in his patronage network that maybe he wasn't and isn't going to be the best horse to bet on in future. And so that's led to some hedging behavior, which has eroded his support. So yes, he's still popular with a lot of people in Turkey, but not as popular as he was even just a few years ago. And he's been in power forever, too. So just incumbency disadvantages popularity. There's a big handicap there. And there's not a lot of politicians in the world who have been around and in power as long as Erdogan has. I think I was still in high school when he first became president of Turkey.
Yeah, it's been a while then. I guess they don't have term limits.
They kind of did, I think. But they changed the constitution, so none of that really ended up mattering.
I see.
Yeah, they kind of jiggled it so that the most powerful position was not the president, but the prime minister. Or maybe I'm getting it backwards. Basically, they kind of pulled a Putin.
Yeah,
Russia had term limit.
He did that where there was someone else, Medvedev, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, he took power, quote, and there are a bunch of memes of Medvedev with Putin like right over his shoulder waving.
Yeah, I don't think Erdogan had to have the middleman step in. I think it was a pretty seamless transition from one seat to the other. But they did change the rules, basically, so that they could get around restrictions. Let's see. 2014? Was I wrong about that? Now I'm curious. How long has he been in power? Yeah, Prime Minister 2003. Okay, so he wasn't president at the time. He started as Prime Minister in 03 until 14. And then he became president in 14. And has just been there ever since. I did trip over on the Sudan update, albeit a minor one. There's some training camps for RSF soldiers that have opened up in Ethiopia, sponsored by the Emiratis, which at this point is exactly who I would expect. For those who don't know, the Emiratis are de facto allied with the RSF, which is one of the two main factions in the Sudanese civil war. The fact that they're opening the camps in Ethiopia is a little surprising. I don't think the Ethiopian government had been involved in the Sudanese civil war that much up until now. So this suggests that they're kind of picking a side. I still don't think they're all that invested, but I suspect that the Emiratis kind of gave them some incentives to allow them to host the camps, and that could augur an alignment for the Ethiopians with the Emiratis in the broader region. I would point out that Ethiopia is actually a heavyweight unto itself in the region. So it's not like just some poor backwards country that the Emiratis are taking advantage of. Ethiopia knows what it's doing here. This will be a strategic decision on their part. And it's not going to put them out anything. They're not any weaker in the region or have to give up anything for it. I think it's basically just free money from the Emiratis or whatever other goodies they're giving them. Yeah, every so often I hear something about tension with Eritrea. I think we've talked before about how there was a big falling out with Eritrea after the whole war in Tigray a couple years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So there's been talk about potential conflict, but I noticed that it never seems to actually go anywhere. So I'm a little skeptical that anything's going to happen. Mm. But then again, I said the same thing at the start of the Sudanese civil war. They'd been talking about the possibility of civil war for months, I think up to a year, leading up to the outbreak of the conflict. So by the time it happened, I was just tuning it out. I didn't think anything would happen. And then boom, RSF made a play and then it was on. The Fed does have its new chair settled. There's been a lot of drama about that. I think somebody on YouTube was asking about that, about fluctuations in the price of gold, and how normally during periods of uncertainty, investors put money into gold and the dollar, but this time it was just gold, but not the dollar. And I think most of that had to do with the Fed drama. Markets were a bit shaken by Trump seeming to signal that he wanted to politicize the Fed. And so markets were kind of waiting to see how the Fed drama played out. And the guy that he ultimately picked, Kevin Warsh, isn't really a great choice. But markets preferred him over the alternatives. And so markets were mostly sated. And as a result, the dollar has been recovering a bit. Yeah, he had actually been in the running to head the Fed in Trump's first term, but ended up losing out partly because markets didn't like him. They saw him as a little too pro-Trump. It kind of says something that he hasn't really changed that much, but is now seen as the less, well, maybe not less pro-Trump. You basically have to be pro-Trump to get the nomination, but the relatively more hawkish option. Hawkish on inflation, I mean. So markets aren't thrilled about it, but they'll take it. The other guys in the running were even more obsequious towards Trump.
Obsequious?
I would defer to you on that. I don't think I've ever heard anybody say it out loud. Yeah, he's, that is to say, the current sitting Fed chair is not actually going to step down for another couple months. So this new appointment is pending. This is the guy Trump will appoint, but The appointment hasn't happened yet. It'll be interesting to see how markets respond when the handover actually occurs, because I'm sure they'll be watching to see just how disruptive the new guy is, or if he's disruptive at all. He may well just run it exactly how Powell has been running it. I remember there was some questions about Powell and his independence. Well, more accurate, whether or not he would run the Fed independently of the president's will, and turned out that he did. So Warsh could run the Fed in a similar way. Questions at the start, but then ends up being independent. Or he could be totally subjugated to Trump's will, and then markets turn on the dollar. Losing confidence in the Fed is going to create some waves in financial markets if it happens. Don't worry, you'll definitely be hearing about that in the news if it comes to that. But for now, peace prevails. So the drama is a couple months away. We'll see what happens. Let's see, I think I did have a couple corrections. Oh yeah, somebody pointed out, I said headwind, I meant tailwind. I got them mixed up. My apologies. Thank you for the correction. Rookie mistake on my part. And then I think we got a correction. I got a correction on YouTube. The LDP in Japan did get a supermajority in the lower house of their legislature, but they actually do not have one in the upper house of their legislature. So that was not a point that I highlighted. I focused purely on the lower house and the elections there when we were talking about it last time. So the pathway to constitutional change is pretty limited because of that. Although I would point out that I was right that they would try. I didn't even have to wait a week, and there was already an article talking about how the LDP and their leadership are going to make an effort to reform the Constitution. I don't think they'll succeed, but that's never stopped them before. They really just can't help themselves. Let's see, I think we did have a couple questions.
Yeah. Thanks, Fuzzy Gold.
Japan's Takeichi had a landslide win. Any musings on impact on U.S. relations, regional Asian politics, and domestic effects? I don't think it's going to change U.S. relations much, because she's basically going to manage that exactly how Kishida and Abe did. And I think we talked a little bit about this last time. Japan has been pretty good at Trump whispering. Mm-hmm. They've been able to handle him pretty well. So I don't expect that to change. So probably U.S. relations will remain the same as they are. No change there. Regional Asian politics, I mean, we've already seen some of the fallout there with the relationship with China kind of being on the rocks. I still think the kerfuffle with China is mostly just superficial bullshit. A lot of it is posturing on the part of the party in China, and maybe to a lesser degree also on the part of Takeichi in Japan. So I don't invest too much in that blow up. But if she, as sort of the populist conservative candidate within, her as the representative of the right-wing populist faction within the LDP, probably will do something that pisses off the region sooner or later. Probably involving the Yasukuni Shrine, if I had to guess, but it could be anything. There's really no telling. The populist right in Japan just pops off at the most random times. They can be a little unpredictable in that regard. So as much drama as there is with China right now, I don't doubt that there will be some other random bullshit that happens that causes nationalists in, say, probably South Korea, honestly, to flip out, but possibly also nationalists in places like the Philippines or Vietnam, depending on the nature of the incident. But beyond that, excuse me, beyond that, I think she'll actually try to engage with the region. Um, I meant to talk about this last time and I didn't get to it because it slipped my mind while I was answering a question that was related to this. The United States has basically outsourced its East Asian foreign policy to Japan. The United States has not been very proactive in the region. Even when it says it wants to pivot to Asia in order to contain China, which is something successive US governments have been saying now for, God, like 15 years, 20 years, and it never really seems to happen. In so much as the United States has been engaging with the region, largely they've just been free riding on Japanese efforts. You might have heard about the Quad, the Quadrilateral Initiative or whatever it is, and then the big trade agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that the United States initiated and then abandoned. Both of those ended up being largely Japanese initiatives. In the case of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, after the United States pulled out, Japan held it together with the other negotiating parties and actually successfully finalized the agreement. So it actually was passed and ratified by basically everybody that had been negotiating except the United States. So Japan tried and successfully did get that agreement across the finish line because that was a landmark agreement designed to mitigate Chinese influence in the region. Without the United States, it's less effective, but without the United States, that also just means that Japan anchors it now, which is good for them because it expands their influence. And then for the quadrilateral, the Quad was actually a Japanese idea in the first place. They were the ones that came up with the idea of having an informal, I don't want to say alliance, but an informal institution, basically a talking shop, effectively, with potential upside in the future that involved Japan, India, the United States, and I think Australia is the other one. And the United States really didn't have an alternative, wasn't even really thinking about, the region enough to even try. And so when Japan put it forward and there was some receptive response on the part of the Indian and Australian governments, the United States just kind of went along with it. So the United States has taken some initiative in the region, mostly in the form of trade stuff, export restrictions, import restrictions, trying to coordinate with allies vis-a-vis things like rare earth materials, as well as trying to engineer a unified response to China, both in terms of export restrictions and in terms of overall foreign strategic policy in the region, basically. But overall, like, the trend for the United States in the region has largely been one of inertia. And Japan has been the one to really pick up the slack and try to engage with nations in the region to try to create a counterweight to Chinese influence actively and not passively like the United States does. The United States government talks a big game, but largely has just relied on the size of bilateral trade with the United States, with various countries in the region. That basically is the main thing. That and defense agreements with this, that, or the other country, which range from full treaty commitments to minor bilateral agreements, most of which are pretty old. None of that is especially new. So that's another example of inertia there. But Japan, by contrast, actually has tried to sign new bilateral agreements. A lot of them pretty minor, but they are showing initiative by trying in the first place, and they have built relationships over time.
Are there any key countries that Japan has done a lot of good work in building allies with?
Mostly Southeast Asia. There's been especially outreach to the Philippines. Some of that has to do with just Japan's defense industrial base. The Abe government loosened restrictions on the export of military equipment. I think they're still not allowed to export lethal stuff, but Abe made it so that they could export non-lethal military equipment. And one of the principal targets for the Japanese government as far as sales ended up being the Philippines. But that was also part and parcel of an initiative by the Japanese government to try to contain Chinese pressure on the Philippines in the South China Sea, which of course Japan has some strategic interest in. So they were kind of killing two birds with one stone. They were generating sales and exports for Japan's defense industry. At the same time, they were bolstering an ally. I think they've also reached out to Taiwan, but to a much lesser degree and certainly less visibly. Being visible there comes with consequences. So they can't be entirely outward with that. But they have been trying to increase engagement with Taiwan. I think there's also been an effort to deal strategically with Vietnam, but I don't think they've had nearly as much traction with that as they've had with the Philippines. They also reach out and maintain nominal economic ties to, say, Malaysia, Indonesia, etc., the other big players in Southeast Asia. But they haven't been as forceful there, and they haven't been able to make as much ground. So the relationships there are more just nominal. We're basically just asserting that Japan is present economically in the region and strategically possibly if partner countries wanted them there. The Japanese government wants to make sure everybody knows that they can provide military equipment. Their military is hypothetically available to help them in the event of a crisis.
It's very reassuring. We could hypothetically help you if something would happen. Oh,
Yeah.
would you like to make a nominal agreement? Oh, I certainly would.
Yeah, but I think economic influence is their main vector for influence in the region still. So lots of investment deals. A lot of manufacturing firms in, say, Malaysia and Thailand are firms that make car parts for Japanese automakers. They've lost a little bit of that trade to China and other low-cost producers like Vietnam, but it is still a big part of the manufacturing economy in those countries, and that in turn gives Japan some leverage in its relations with those countries. So anyway, that's all just to say that Japan is a major diplomatic force in the region, and that the United States kind of free rides on their efforts to a degree. So everybody in the United States should be thanking Japan for doing their dirty work for them. Basically actually doing the diplomatic work of building relationships in the region in a way that somewhat offsets Chinese influence. Washington has been kind of MIA in that regard for a while.
That's fine, I'll do it. Dear Japan, as an American, I'm grateful for your diplomatic efforts in the region of Asia, while our administration figures out what it wants to do there.
Well said.
Keep it up.
Oh, I should mention too that Japan has a number of bilateral agreements with India. Again, all economic, not strategic, but basically investment agreements. I think there's a big corridor, a transportation corridor between, I want to say, New Delhi and Mumbai, that Japan is, well, more accurately, Japanese banks, at the behest of the Japanese government, are heavily involved in. And I think they have other little investment agreements as well. Japan actually has a surprisingly large profile economically in Indian markets. I think we've talked before about how Suzuki has a dominant share of India's car market.
Mm. Yeah, I remember you mentioning the success of Japanese car makers compared to American ones because they were more suited to the situations that Indian consumers wanted, as opposed to American consumers.
Well, more to the point, like they actually paid attention to Indian consumers and made changes as necessary.
Mm-hmm.
Hypothetically, American automakers could do that. They just failed utterly to do so.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not so much about American consumers, it's more of an indictment about poor strategy on the part of US automakers. They kind of shit the bed on that one. And they don't have anybody to blame for that but themselves.
Mm.
So all of that is to illustrate Japan's relations in the region and their approach to dealing with strategic rivalry with China. They're going to continue doing that. I don't think that's going to change. I don't think I've heard anything from Takeichi that suggests a dramatic break with Japan's established foreign policy in that vein. So while it's unfortunate that there will be drama owing to her fealty, let's say, to certain right-wing populist dogmas in the LDP, overall, I think Japan's relations in the region are going to largely be defined by status quo ante. I don't foresee any dramatic changes there. And then as far as Takeichi's effect on Japan's domestic politics, I mean, the effect she's already had is to kind of re-energize, not kind of, she has re-energized the LDP, restored some of its popular image, and she's gotten young Japanese voters involved in politics to a much greater degree than any politician in Japan in recent memory. Whether or not she can sustain any of that is going to be the big question. If she can, then that'll represent a dramatic change in the landscape of Japanese politics. But I suspect, as probably most people in Japan do, that she will not be able to maintain it. Probably the LDP is going to end up in a position very similar to where it was pre-Takeichi within a couple of years. But they at least have a new tailwind. There we go.
Got it.
They have a tailwind now with Takeichi, and so that's given them a new lease on life, at least in the short term. So maybe they can do something with that to revive their fortunes in the long term. We shall see. But for now, her effect on domestic politics, I would argue, I think the jury is still out on that. We're going to have to wait a while.
Chad also wanted to ask about the Board of Peace.
Oh, fuck.
How's that going? Is it still peaceful?
It's still there and it's still dumb. Not a lot of takers. Mostly the countries that have agreed to join are countries with leaders that are populists who are trying to win favor with the Trump administration. So all of the usual suspects, Javier Milei in Argentina, Viktor Orban in Hungary. I think the new president of Chile, Cast, has expressed an interest. Canada was disinvited. They're not allowed to join. China has basically said no. I think they did kind of caveat their answer a little bit, but effectively they've said that they're not going to join. So, and I don't think any major European nations have agreed to join. So it's basically just Trump and friends at this point,
I see.
which was the most likely outcome. No surprises there. Technically, it was originally intended to oversee the reconstruction of Gaza. They are moving forward with that. But they haven't really had much traction in terms of actually reaching the third phase of the peace deal that was supposed to be signed. I think they're still working on that. And Israel has been doing some incendiary shit that's going to make that harder, not easier. And I haven't seen the so-called Board of Peace address any of that. So yeah, it's like a lot of things Trump does, it's a vanity project.
It's a meme.
Yeah, there doesn't seem to be any substance there at the moment. Maybe that changes in the future, but for now, I don't take it seriously. Let's see. What is my view of the corruption of this administration, as well as levels of federal corruption throughout U.S. history? How unusual is this blatant graft and grift from Trump? I'm wondering if his recent readings into 19th century U.S. can inform this. Yeah, early 19th century America was corrupt as fuck. Much more so than even now with the Trump administration. But the Trump administration does kind of recall an era of American politics where corruption was just endemic and normalized. I think Trump probably has more in common with the bosses of bosses of political machines. There we go. In the late 19th century, more so than the early 19th century, where political machines were actually pretty novel. I think the first political machine in American history was the Albany Regency, or at least that's what I was reading anyway. And that didn't really emerge until the 18 teens. And then the model took off very quickly after that, and politicians found that very engaging. Just being able to graft the public. But the model didn't really get prominent until, I shouldn't say it didn't really get ubiquitous until a bit later. It kind of took a few decades for it to kind of spread everywhere. But once it did, it became quite common. And yeah, the big boss, the political machine boss, seems to be what Trump either explicitly or kind of unknowingly, implicitly models himself after. That is how he acts. But I think it's more late 19th than early 19th century in style. But yeah, as far as comparing levels of corruption across American history, that's a good question. Trump definitely represents a discontinuity, because in general, the trend line from the mid-20th century had been one of less corruption in American politics. It was never absent, don't misread me, it's definitely always been there. But the trend had been that it was getting better. There were more and better efforts at the national level and also at local and state levels at building and or improving institutions to inhibit and mitigate corruption in politics. So we were getting better over time, and then Trump happens, and Trump doesn't give a shit. And apparently a good chunk of the public doesn't give a shit. I mean, a lot of the institutions, as well as the norms in American politics that Trump thumbs his nose at, were created specifically in response to demand by voters to constrain the bad behavior of politicians like Trump. But voters now seem to like that. It's kind of counterintuitive. But I don't really expect voters in modern America to kind of understand the genesis of anti-corruption institutions, especially when those institutions are frequently decades old now. So maybe it's unfair to say that voters are being irrational by demanding reforms, getting them, and then voting in politicians that dismantle them. But that's a process that's happened over the course of 40 to 50 years. It's not really the same voters doing one or the other. I think that just speaks to an overall malaise in American political culture and amongst the general population. People are tired and are voting desperately. Maybe that's being too charitable on their part. Most people live pretty well, but there does seem to be a broader discontent in the general voting public for whatever reason. The reasons are a whole conversation unto themselves. But there is a broader discontent there, and that's manifested in successive attempts over time to vote in reform. And apparently the efforts to vote in reformers have not been satisfactory, because now we're voting in people that are dismantling the old reforms. So maybe that's the consistent thread, just voting in change of whatever kind, trying to disrupt the status quo.
I think the emotion behind the voters putting Trump in for 2 terms is more of an emotional response and resistance to just the establishment in general, and the effectiveness of Trump's branding on being the anti-establishment candidate who is tearing down the bad stuff in the system. And that branding and that sort of vibe that's created is more important for controlling the regular voters than actually following through whatever the substantive elements of conservatives or progressives might be.
Mm-hmm.
He speaks in a very, very human, relatable, almost silly manner that, well, it actually is silly, that really captures like the regular person's way of just rambling. He rambles like some people ramble. So, and exaggerates in a way that gets you excited. So he's got that, I would say, charlatan background where he has TV experience. He's very comfortable being in front of people. In fact, that's his favorite thing in the whole wide world is to be getting attention in front of people. So his ability to direct the like sentiment of the population to the point that they vote for him twice. I think it's more of that than that people wanted what he's doing.
Yeah, I would agree. There's definitely a strong emotive drive in American politics, and Trump has definitely been a beneficiary. He's the candidate of disruption. But yeah, I think if you go back to, say, the 1930s and 40s, political machines were still very common in the United States at that time. FDR basically was the head of a giant patronage network in which a whole multitude of minor political machines across the country were a part. He was basically king of the political machines. That's not an aspect of his politics and presidency that we necessarily talk about too much. We generally try to we prefer in the United States to focus on the aspects of his leadership that were more laudable. You know, leading the country through World War II, the Great Depression. People on the left, especially like the New Deal programs, the three-letter agencies. Those are a little more controversial on the right, but in general, those are the things he's more remembered for, as opposed to um, being the most successful political machine boss in U.S. history. Getting the bosses of political machines to work together and join your patronage network, that's hard to do. That's like herding cats, but FDR managed it, and that was a big part of his success.
Successful cat herder. Good work.
I think before that, there was actually one of the dominant political trends in the United States in the late 19th century was early progressivism. And a big part of progressivism at that time was anti corruption, basically. They wanted to get graft out of government. They wanted to get nepotism out of government. They wanted to dismantle the spoils system. For those of you who are not Americans, the spoils system was basically just a system wherein people were given appointments to positions in government based purely on loyalty rather than on merit. Very frequently, positions were just given out as a reward for donating money, donating time, delivering votes to a given machine boss, etc. Probably it's a style of politics a lot of people listening in other countries are familiar with, depending on where you live. That was very common in the United States up until relatively recently. Again, maybe like 70 years ago. And even then, its death was gradual. It kind of faded out over time. There are still some machines left in the United States, generally not as strong as they used to be, but still present. Chicago is a good example. There's still parts of Texas that I think that have localized families, localized machines headed by families that have been running them for generations. Nothing too big, but they do still exist technically. But back in the early 20th century and late 19th century, they were very prominent, and progressives kind of made it their business to try to fight them. and getting rid of the spoil system was a big part of that. So there were a number of initiatives that were made at that time to try to mitigate graft and the spoil system. One of them was a law that tried to professionalize the civil service, so that positions in the civil service in the United States would no longer be given out basically as rewards. You were supposed to give them out based off of merit. So there was a whole system created there to try to police that. I'm struggling to remember other examples of initiatives like that, but I know there were more. I remember it was, what was the president? I want to say Grover Cleveland. The Cleveland presidency in the late 19th century was basically the result of this anti-corruption progressivism. He also had to kind of participate in the machine politics a little bit because it was just so prominent in politics at the time, but he was the choice of progressives in that era. And he was one of the only Democrat presidents in the late 19th century, specifically for that reason, because they were able to split off some of the anti-corruption voters in the Republican Party. It's actually kind of a funny contrast now that I think about it. Grover Cleveland was the only president before Donald Trump to have discontinuous terms.
Huh.
Yeah. Cleveland won the presidency, served 4 years, lost re-election, but then came back and won 4 years later. So it's a little funny. He was the anti-corruption progressive candidate of his era. And then the next guy to get discontinuous terms was Donald Trump.
Pro-corruption?
Yeah. Yeah.
You call it corruption, I call it business. That's funny.
Yeah, so comparing levels of corruption across time, I would say late 19th century, early 20th century is probably when machine politics were at their peak. But there was slow improvement over time to the point where starting in the mid 20th century on, we were able to dramatically kind of correct the course and create a much less corrupt political system. Still with problems, but a significant improvement over what came before. I think early 19th century and the first 20-some years of the last 20-some years of the 1700s, it's kind of hard to compare because the politics of that era were so different. You know, there was barely a national politics to speak of in that time because the country was brand new. And basically every state still kind of implicitly thought of itself as its own country and had its own political system, political culture, its own electoral laws. Like they really were sort of their own little countries at that time. And so you kind of it's hard to generalize the whole country's politics at that time correspondingly. But a whole region of the country, the South, was basically feudal. You know, the plantation system was kind of an emulation of the feudal system in Europe. And the style of politics there was correspondingly patrician, very much dominated by elites. And political competition, such as it was in a system like that, was very much just competition between different groups of elites, different plantation owners, basically. And that's kind of a different style of politics than the popular politics that you get with universal suffrage. When you do restrict the franchise such that the only people who vote are like the feudal elites who own all the land and literally own people, that style of politics is much more clubby. It's less the politics of partisanship and emotive popular issues and more the politics that you might see within a personal group within a club. It's this guy and his clique against this other guy and his clique. The politics may not actually even differ all that much between the cliques. It's really just more personal. You know, I want me and my network to run things because I think we're the best. And we're going to run against these other guys who are probably running on a platform that's like 90% the same as ours. but who differ on a couple of issues of substance and also differ on style.
Yeah. Or they're a competitor to me, so you should vote for me because I want power,
Yeah,
not because I'm doing anything different. Like, we have the same religion, we have the same values, we have the same morals, but I want the spot. Vote for me.
yeah, yeah. So I've been trying to identify regional differences in American politics in that period. Again, early 19th century, and trying to kind of pin down also regions within states and how politics differs between them. And it's kind of hard to do because what I found is that a lot of the politics in this period was more personalistic like this. So regions that should have stuff in common and should vote the same don't. And the reason they don't is because they're not really voting on issues, they're voting more on personality, loyalty to this, that, or the other patronage network.
Mm.
It was a little different in New England. New England had politics that were more familiar, but also way more patrician than they are now. One of the things that surprised me is just how elitist New England was at that time. A lot of the elite in New England did not like the idea of universal suffrage. They didn't like the idea of like feudal systems like what they had in the South. That was too much for them. But that didn't mean that they thought there should be a popular vote. They very much thought that voting should be restricted to people of good social standing, shall we say, as they defined it at the time. Yeah, pretty much the only region that had politics that really resemble modern notions of democratic politics, where, one man, one vote, popular politics, etc. Pretty much the only place that was like that in the early 19th century in the United States was Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania comes out looking real good the more you read about this era. Universal suffrage very early on, banning slavery very early on. Quakers were great, very chill people, actual pacifists, didn't want to fuck up the natives. Ended up doing it anyway because they didn't have a lot of choice. That was just kind of where the public was at the time, but they did advocate against it. So overall, 10 out of 10 stars for early 19th century Pennsylvania. They pretty well rocked it by by modern standards anyway. By the standards of their day, it was quite radical. They were very much seen as the extremists of the era. Giving people the popular vote, that's crazy. How could you?
Mm-hmm.
But they still had corruption too. Benjamin Franklin himself actually exploited his position. I don't remember what position he had exactly. It might have been governor. But whatever it was in Pennsylvania, he used it to give his son a job. So very explicit nepotism. And that was just kind of the norm at the time. It wasn't unusual. In fact, you could say part of what distinguished the late 19th century corruption from the early 19th century corruption is less the substance of it and more just the public perception. In the early 19th century, there was still a sense that a certain amount of graft from politicians was just normal and expected, and a perk of the job, one might say. Whereas in the late 19th century, the public's perception had shifted dramatically to being very, very much against graft of that variety. Maybe part of that was just the result of growth in government. Government in the early 19th century was still quite small. At both the national, state, and local level, it wasn't really all that intrusive. But as the country developed, government grew correspondingly and became more intrusive. And as the money and budgets available to governments grew, so did the temptation for corruption, and so too then did the public's interest in mitigating corruption. But regardless, corrupt either way. Early 19th century, very corrupt. Late 19th century, probably even more corrupt, maybe, depending on how you want to define it. Lots of ubiquitous machine politics, let's say that. And then that just continues for a century, and then upswing, I guess I should say. An upswing in the quality of government for 60, 70 years up until present, and now we're kind of figuring things out. maybe we don't want government to be as clean as it was. And I think there's a sense amongst some voters that uh, clean government is a lie, and that actually government is much more corrupt than the popular public perception, and that the way to deal with it is to vote in disruptors of one kind or another, like
People who
say
just
Donald
mess
Trump.
things up. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. You know, they would push back against the notion that things were going well. They'd say that it's worse than we know, and we need to completely fuck things up in order to fix it. And the result of that, of course, is that things are now just objectively much worse. Much worse. I don't really see improvement in the levels of corruption in government under the Trump administration. So I don't know how to deal with that. Like there is a certain point when voters just have to take responsibility, right? Democracy only works if voters take their responsibilities as citizens seriously. And if they don't, then you don't get to have a democracy. It's not going to work. That's not a problem you can legislate your way out of.
Yeah, that's one of the, I guess, the weights of democracy on society is it puts a little bit more pressure on the individual to pull their weight to make sure the right decision is made. Because if you distribute votes to each individual, then they do have greater than zero weight in deciding the fate of the nation. But if the individuals are not educating themselves on the best route forward for their country, and they're not thinking of like laws that should be in place that make sense that we can agree on, then the masses are going to be a tyranny. Like that was one of the things that I think the US was trying to set up with the branches of government and the electoral college was protection against the tyranny of the masses. The masses aren't necessarily well informed and they don't necessarily know how best to execute a political agenda. Like that's a pretty complex thing to navigate, is making sure everything is written out and official and following the like existing laws and rules of your country. That's advanced. That requires a lot of research and legalese to an extent. So how do you boil down the real human issues and then get your populace to vote in a wise manner? That's pretty tricky. In an authoritarian system with one ruler, the ruler just decides everything for you and you have no say. So that pressure is off. That's someone else's call. But in a democracy, you have the freedom to collectively do dumb shit together.
Well, certainly American voters have done no small amount of that over the country's history, as I'm finding out recently in my reading. It really is a bottomless well.
What are some examples during that time period?
Oh my God, just for one, the endemic violence on the frontier. One of the things I was reading about a couple days ago was that there was a divide between officers in the US military and militiamen on the frontier. Because the officers were generally from the East. They were generally pretty well educated and they were generally professionals. They didn't necessarily love the Native Americans they were fighting on the frontier, but they were willing to parley with them, negotiate, come to agreements, etc. The militia, on the other hand, were basically in a state of perpetual genocidal ethnic conflict with natives on the frontier through the late 1700s and early 1800s. And their impression of the natives was very, very negative. They did not like them. And they actually disliked the fact that the US government and the officers they were sending to help fight the Indian Wars at that time were not more aggressive. You know, they believed that the government wasn't doing enough to protect them from Indian raids and that the government needed to be much more proactive in wiping out the natives. That was their attitude. And the divide between those two perspectives could be very frank. You know, it could be very stark, rather. There's a couple of times, you know, I'll kind of save it for when we get into more of the details, but there were multiple incidents where generals in the US military wanted to meet with Native American leaders to negotiate the peaceful end to a conflict or to sign an agreement to avoid a potential conflict, where the negotiations were completely derailed because the fucking militiamen just straight up murdered the Native American emissary. Like, just flat fucking out. Like, when they're meeting, somebody would just run up to them and fucking kill them on the spot. And that was popular. That was what the public on the frontier wanted. They liked that shit. So that doesn't really reflect well on them. And that, I think that qualifies as an example of the voting public doing dumb shit. You could argue that the Civil War is an example of dumb shit. I would argue that, as I have before on here, that other countries in the Western Hemisphere got rid of slavery without fighting a hugely destructive conflict. The United States is pretty much the only one that did. So we could have handled that better. That probably qualifies as dumb shit as well.
I see.
Probably the whole War of 1812, but that's a whole conversation unto itself. Picking a fight with the world's reigning superpower for just arbitrary bullshit reasons, that's not a good look.
What was the reason for it again?
There were multiple reasons. Like I said, it's a whole conversation. We can get into it. It would be better to get into it later when we kind of get more into the region in detail. I'm still working on that. I spent a good chunk of the week making maps.
Okay. We'll get there then.
Yeah, we'll definitely get to it at some point. But the Cliff Notes version is impressment, wherein British Royal Navy ships were actually just kidnapping American sailors off of American ships and forcing them to serve in the Royal Navy. As you might know, the British were fighting the Napoleonic Wars at that time, and on account of that, had something of a shortage of sailors. They were very much in demand at the time. There was also alleged, although it ended up being actually true, British support to Native American groups that were hostile to the United States along the frontier. And also, there was the fact that slaves were running away to Spanish Florida, where they were, again, receiving British support to engage in cross-border raids. Yeah, there were a couple other outstanding issues, like British forts on American territory and some other things that slipped my mind, but those were the main drivers. And I would point out that a lot of those were kind of residual issues that had been lingering for some time. They were not really new issues that came out of nowhere. Basically, tracking America's relationship with Britain from the Revolutionary War to the War of 1812, you can see tensions just kind of gradually building over time. So the war was basically the penultimate expression of those tensions.
I told my parents we were going to talk about this time period. It's one that isn't really discussed much in public school education of the United States. There's heavy emphasis on the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, but the period between the two of those gets very little attention.
Yeah, I'm learning why. It was not an era that was very glorious for the United States. There were a lot of problems, extreme violence, like just crazy, gratuitous, almost Quentin Tarantino-esque violence. Yeah, it's not the kind of stuff you really want to teach kids in like middle school. I don't really know how it's possible to teach the details of frontier violence in a way that's kid friendly. Like it is some gnarly shit. And that's just the frontier. That doesn't even get into slavery in the South. That doesn't get into all the stuff New England was getting up to. Generally, New England was doing better. Not quite so gratuitously violent, per se, but they had their own issues. Pennsylvania, again, was great. More power to them.
Good job, Pennsylvania. Yeah, Quakers were definitely people who would have been seen as very almost like hippie Christians,
Yeah.
where it's built off of the Bible and Christianity, but it's way more progressive. It's even more progressive than modern, like mainstream Christianity is today, where it's super tolerant of other belief systems, very tolerant of different types of people, very much like you do you as long as you're nice, is kind of the vibe that it gives off. And it's trying to be, like you mentioned, pacifist, even, which most Christians are very, I wouldn't say violent, but tolerant of violence and understanding that violence is a part of life. And there are certain times when you should fight to defend yourself. Like, that's an attitude thing that most Christians and most people in the world have. But Quakers were strictly and specifically pacifist. Even if you get attacked, you should still not attack, which is very radical of an idea. Militarily, very unsmart as well.
Yeah. And Quakers sometimes got a lot of heat for that. Although I would point out that doesn't mean they deserve to be arbitrarily murdered, which was apparently a thing during the Revolutionary War.
Hmm.
Pacifists in general during the Revolutionary War did not make out very well. Everything I read about them at that time suggests that both the British and the Patriots suspected them of being spies. And they were then the target of considerable mistreatment over the course of the conflict, specifically because of that. It was all pretty ugly, but some of the massacres I read about on the frontier related to the Revolutionary War kind of put even that to shame.
Damn.
Well, let's see. I don't have, I think, any other big updates. We could try to finish the highlight reel again. We made it halfway through last time.
Sure. We are hour and a half in, so as you like.
Okay. So this is just stuff the Trump administration has done that's not necessarily big enough to kind of warrant discussing individually. This is just sort of a laundry list of items that are of concern or that were at least in the news for a while, but that are otherwise relatively marginal in the grand scheme of things. So it's the Trump highlight reel. So the last thing that we were about to get to before we cut off last time when we were last doing this was Trump announcing the Golden Fleet. This involves a new class of battleships, which will be the flagships of the new fleet. And it's going to be called, as you might guess, the Trump class. It's not clear that anything will come of this, which is normally what I say when I'm talking about new Trump initiatives. This is very much in the same vein. It takes years to design ships. It takes years to build them. Like, Trump will be out of office by the time this goes anywhere. But in the meantime, there is room for graft, as always. You know, even designing a ship costs money, so I don't doubt there will be opportunities there. But I definitely would write this off. I'm inclined to write this off anyway in the short term. I don't think anything will come of this one. But the internet definitely had a field day with this. You know, there were mock-ups, models, and pictures of what the new Trump-class battleship would look like. So people were definitely getting a lot of fun out of that.
Here's a question for you. If
right.
you could be named after some kind of, let's say, a military vehicle or plane or something, what type would you pick? If it was an Agent Smith craft.
Wait, what was the question? I missed the first part of it.
If you could have a military thing named after you, like a battleship or a plane or something like that, what kind of thing would you have named after you? tank, stuff like
Well, my first instinct would be to resist naming it after me, since that would probably curse it.
that.
It'd be bad luck. But if I had to pick something, I don't know. Guess an aircraft. I don't really have any particular attachment to any particular vehicle.
Yeah. I would definitely want to be a super fast plane. A new type of Blackbird scouting thing that goes incredibly fast, flies near space. That sounds cool.
There you go. Have you ever heard of the X-15?
X-15. No?
Yeah, that was an experimental plane from back in the 60s, I want to say. Might be misremembering the correct decade there. But if you like super fast planes, the X-15 is definitely going to be your bag.
It looks like a missile almost. Huh.
Yeah, it was designed to go several times the speed of sound. It held the record for a long time for fastest aircraft.
Yeah, it looks like the pilot's wearing basically a spacesuit. Cool.
Yeah, they had some wild experimental planes back in the day. Yeah, let's see. Oh God, there was the whole Rob Reiner thing. Do you remember this?
No?
There was the director. There was a director named Rob Reiner. Did some famous movies. I think Princess Bride was one of them.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I
Yeah, so he
remember
was.
now.
Yeah. So he was found murdered, and it turned out to be his son. And it was a whole thing. There was a whole tragedy around it. And then Trump's contribution to that conversation was to suggest that Rayner had been murdered because he had Trump derangement syndrome, for which he got the expected amount of heat.
And that was when you're so happy about what Trump is doing for your country that it causes stress with your friends and family. Is that what that one is?
That is one possible definition, yeah. The definition kind of shifts depending on the needs of a given argument.
I see.
Okay, so retaliation. The Defense Department cut Senator Mark Kelly's pension, alleging misconduct. This is broadly seen as retaliation for comments that he made that were critical of the Trump administration. So you can't do that. You're not supposed to use things like pensions and other payments and whatnot to try to intimidate your political enemies. So that was a very explicit case of the government abusing its power. That probably would have gotten more criticism if there weren't so much other drama going on with the administration. But as far as abuses by the Trump admin, that was one of the more obvious ones. Let's see, there was an executive order in which Trump ordered the withdrawal of the United States from over 60 international agencies. This ended up being mostly just agencies of the United Nations. And it's not a full withdrawal from all UN agencies. The United States is going to stay involved with those that involve some degree of competition with China. Generally, these involve the setting of standards in different industries, which the Chinese government has tried to intervene in order to kind of set standards that are more favorable to Chinese manufacturers. The United States wants to kind of offset that, obviously, so it's going to stay involved with those. But others involving, especially purely humanitarian or sometimes political or sometimes health initiatives, those will not see American involvement going forward. Let's see. Trump went on Truth Social and said that he wanted the military budget to increase from $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion. There was no lead up to this, and there was no follow up. Just, I want $1.5 trillion for the U.S. military, and then he does exactly nothing to make it happen, and then it just went away. Yeah, that would be a dramatic increase in the military budget. It's not clear why he even wants it. He did not elaborate on that. Maybe this comes back later, but for now, it just seems like one of those things that would have been very dramatic if he followed up on it, but then just went away because he failed to do so. So this next one was something that was actually popular. So Trump announced that he was going to move to ban Wall Street firms from buying single-family homes. This nominally was an effort to try and mitigate inflation, specifically increases in the price of homes. So this is something that people across the political spectrum have been talking about for a while and have actually wanted to see. So a lot of people were actually quite contented to hear this from Trump. I don't think there was actually any follow-up, though. And it was pointed out in the article I read about this that the financial industry buying homes is not a major driver of inflation in housing. I think we talked a little bit about this a couple months ago. It is a factor, but it is not the factor behind housing inflation. Let's see, another example of retaliation. So this would have been December 2025, I think. Trump vetoed he vetoed the following: a $1.3 billion drinking water project in Colorado, and a $14 million project in the Everglades National Park that would have benefited the Miccosukee, I cannot pronounce that, a tribe of Native Americans in the region. So the reason that he vetoed these basically has to do with retaliation. One, in the case of Colorado and the drinking water project, it was punishment for the state of Colorado failing to release a woman who had been arrested for very explicitly interfering in the 2020, was it the 2024 election or the 2020 election? I'm suddenly failing to remember. Well, basically, she had tried to change the outcome of the vote by interfering in the counting of the vote. And she went to jail for that. Trump says she's a political prisoner and that she needs to be released and that she should be pardoned. The state of Colorado disagrees and has refused to do so. And so part of the punishment for that apparently involves the denial of funds for this project. As for the Everglades National Park, apparently the tribe of Native Americans involved, who would have benefited from the money involved in the project, had fought an immigration detention center that was located on their territory. So cutting them off from the funds was apparently in retaliation for that. Oh, I should have read my note. Her name was Tina Peters. This is the woman in Colorado. She was a former election official found guilty of tampering with voting machines in the 2020 presidential election. There we go.
Oops.
So let's see. In another anti-inflation initiative, Trump announced, this would have been, I guess, January this year. Trump called for a one-year cap on credit card interest rates of 10%. This is another Truth Social post. Hasn't been any follow-up to this, but nominally this is the Trump administration trying to tackle inflation by trying to limit how much credit card companies can charge people. This is another one that would be pretty popular if he actually did do this. A lot of people have to pay usurious rates on their credit cards. So if Trump actually did put a cap on it, I think a lot of people would like that. But as you might imagine, credit card companies pushed back pretty hard on this after he announced it. So it's probably not going anywhere. So in another populist outburst, Trump proposed defense reform. Now, this one really caught my eye because defense reform is actually a substantive public policy issue that has been talked about for many, many years in Washington. And so when Trump announced that he was interested in doing something in that vein, I was simultaneously cautiously optimistic and amused, because I knew it would almost certainly be some dumb shit that would make me laugh. So what it ended up being was a proposed crackdown on payouts to bosses and shareholders of major U.S. defense contractors. The argument being that too much money paid by the government to these contractors was going towards things like stock buybacks and dividends, and that money should instead go to reducing the cost of contracts so that the taxpayers' money could be saved. So Trump apparently added a caveat here. He said that the only way to avoid this would be if the firms in question sped up the deliveries of armaments and the construction of new manufacturing plants. So what could have been a popular policy and a substantive effort at defense reform instead is just Trump trying to leverage the US government's monopolistic status, not monopolistic, monopsony status with defense firms to try to get better deals, quote unquote. He also complained about executive pay at defense firms, but I think we all know nothing is going to come of that. So more retaliation. Some funds were withheld from Democratic-controlled states for basically no particular reason. It was $10 billion in funding for child care subsidies, social services, and cash support for low-income families, specifically in 5 states controlled by Democrats. These were Minnesota, New York, California, Illinois, and Colorado. So the nominal impetus here was claiming that, this is Trump himself making these claims, that there is widespread fraud throughout these states. And this had to do with basically the fallout of the fraud involving daycare centers in Minnesota, I believe. Let's see, so the total amount is $10 billion. Breaking it down by program, it was $7.3 billion in funding for temporary assistance for needy families. That's the name of the program, which provides cash assistance to households with children. $2.4 billion for the Child Care and Development Fund, which supports child care for working parents. And then $870 million for social services grants of one kind or another. Visa processing for 75 countries was halted. We talked about this when it happened a while back. Denaturalization. So Trump said that his administration is going to revoke the citizenship of any naturalized immigrant from Somalia or any other country who is convicted of defrauding our citizens. That's a quote from the article. That's not legal, as you might guess. So if he does do that, it's definitely going to end up in court and being struck down. But it was certainly a very bold statement, and that was another one that made the rounds on the internet. Let's see, politicizing Stars and Stripes. If you don't know what Stars and Stripes is, it's a, I don't want to say newspaper, it's more of a newsletter, I guess. A newsletter that focuses on reporting news relevant to personnel in the US military. It has its roots in World War II, but I don't think it actually started publishing continuously until a couple decades after that. And the idea behind it basically is that it can vouch for the GIs, the rank and file members of the military who might otherwise not have a voice. So the Trump administration doesn't like that. Nominally, Stars and Stripes is supposed to be independent, but practically speaking, They do take money from the government, and whether or not strings are attached to that is pretty much at the discretion of the executive. And so what the Trump administration announced was a plan to exert control over the newspaper to, quote, refocus its content away from woke distractions that siphon morale and adapt it to serve a new generation of service members, end quote. So that suggests more censorship and less of a free hand in determining editorial line and what stories the newspaper writes. In the article I read, they asserted that half of the content in the newspaper/newsletter going forward would come directly from the Department of Defense, which would be a pretty significant discontinuity from the previous status quo. Let's see, we talked about the Greenland stuff. That's old news at this point.
Mm-hmm. So the U.S. is not going to invade Greenland.
Correct. Correct. Let's see. The feds raided Fulton County, specifically their electoral office, supposedly to investigate 2020 election fraud. I think we talked about this a little bit when it happened, but I don't think I ever talked about Tulsi Gabbard being there. Her job does not involve internal police work at all. She's basically a national security advisor. So nobody really could explain what the fuck she was doing there. And I don't think I've heard any explanation for that even now, more than a month or so later. So make of that what you will. Tulsi Gabbard doing things in the government. Doesn't seem to be anything she's getting paid to do, but she is doing things. Trump sued the federal government that he runs. That was a weird one. It's a
why?
10. Oh, I'm getting to that. Trust me. So it's a $10 billion lawsuit against the Internal Revenue Service and the Treasury Department. And Trump is arguing here that the IRS failed to prevent the disclosure of his personal financial information. This had to do with the leak of his tax returns, which was a big deal back in his first term, but has long since been forgotten. Trump remembers, and he's suing his own government over it. He says, I shit you not, that he is going to reach a settlement with himself. This apparently, that's a quote. And apparently this would involve him donating the proceeds to charities of his choice, he says. So the Department of Justice, on behalf of the Treasury, has 60 days to decide whether or not to fight this in court or to settle it. He says, that is to say, Trump has discussed this with his Attorney General, Pam Bondi, and he says that she agrees with the charity donation plan. So presumably that's going to augur some kind of deal. He has a couple other ongoing suits as well. He launched legal action against the Department of Justice after the 2022 FBI search of Mar-a-Lago, in which all of the documents that were found in his bathroom were discovered. That case is ongoing. He also sued the Department of Justice for investigating the links between his 2016 presidential campaign and Russia, which of course he calls a hoax. That case also is ongoing. So he has 3 cases at least ongoing against his own government here. I don't know if he's going to reach a deal, quote unquote, in the latter 2 cases, but he seems to be well on his way to a deal in the former case. It's entirely possible that he's just going to give the money that he gets to charities that he and his family are involved with, in which case he's basically just paying himself. We'll see what happens with that. My confidence is pretty low that he's going to be honest about it, but we'll see. Oh, here's
Has
a
this
fun
been
one
done
for you.
before? Have other presidents sued their own government for stuff?
Not to my knowledge. Certainly not in circumstances like this. Yeah, maybe chat knows better. If they do, let us know. I'll throw out the usual disclaimer here. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. I have more of a background in economics and foreign policy. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please let me know. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later. We do appreciate the feedback we get on here, even if it's to let me know that I'm disgustingly self-congratulatory. All feedback is welcome.
That's a fun descriptor of a person. Disgustingly self-congratulatory.
Yeah, it's good writing. Full credit. I've been called worse. At least that's a fancy insult. Okay, so the U.S. government announced that it's preparing to fund MAGA-aligned think tanks and charities across Europe to promote what it calls, quote, American values, unquote, and also to challenge perceived threats to free speech. You can imagine how Europe is reacting to that. They are not amused. But apparently the State Department is serious about this. They've been kind of laying the groundwork, meeting with local officials in Europe, etc. So they are going to move forward with that. Much to my amusement, there was a guy in Reform UK, Nigel Farage's party, that said that the fund was basically a slush fund for MAGA-aligned initiatives. Mind you, Reform would be one of the beneficiaries of this agreement, so it's telling that he was quite that explicit about it. The US government, for its part, rejected that characterization, asserting that it was a, quote, transparent and lawful use of public resources, unquote. Well, that may be true, but color me skeptical. I'm pretty dubious about it. Given the way the administration spends its money, I'm not optimistic about this one. But pity the poor Europeans who now have to deal with the US government that is very explicitly supporting groups, many of which are considered extremists by governments on the continent. It certainly puts them in a very awkward position. I think everybody knows now about the post portraying Barack and Michelle Obama as monkeys that got quite a bit of fallout on social media. That speaks for itself. Let's see. Trump made comments about nationalizing midterm elections. I think we talked a little bit about this already. Somebody asked about it last week. So I won't, what's the word I want?
Belabor the point?
Belabor the point. Let's go with that. I don't have anything new to add from what the statements from last week. Let's put it like that. That's going to bug that. There's a particular word I'm looking for, and it's not coming. Anyway, that's it for the Trump highlight reel. That covers like 3 months or so worth of drama. So combined with the last Trump highlight reel, we pretty much got 2025 and early 26 covered now.
Good job. Yeah, it seems like there's a very major difference in signal to noise ratio for this presidency for the claim of something that's going to get accomplished versus the execution of something actually getting done. Because I think a lot of leaders are pretty cautious about what they're going to claim to do just because of accountability, but because of how much Trump occupies the news cycle and how much he says to do, as long as something is happening with him, he's spinning it in a positive way. And then the next thing is happening so quickly that it doesn't really matter what the last thing was because people are too busy talking about the current thing. But before, it seemed like a lot of presidents, you don't even know what they did. But with him, it's like it seems like he's doing so much shit, but because he doesn't follow through with things like Greenland, he says this wild stuff like we're going to acquire another country. 2 weeks later, nothing about it. It's a completely dead topic.
Yeah, what's the phrase? Much ado about nothing. Sturm and Drang. Is that one of them? A little wary about quoting something in German without remembering exactly what it means. Okay, yeah. It's not Nazis. That's what I was worried about. I'm good. It does fit. Was there anything in particular you wanted to kind of get to? Any topic?
Equatorial Guinea. They moved their capital recently, didn't they?
Did they?
Yeah.
I don't think so.
I don't know how recently. But I thought it used to be because they own an island that's off the coast of the mainland. And I think the capital used to be there and now it's on the mainland.
Huh. Yeah, I guess you're right. I didn't catch that. Interesting. Yeah, historically, the capital has always been on the offshore islands. And the actual mainland territory has kind of been an afterthought. The government has always been very authoritarian and corrupt, so all of the money that should have gone towards investing in the people, building human capital, building infrastructure, all of that just went to the leader instead. So the mainland territory of Equatorial Guinea is not well developed. It's very poor, very backwards. So the fact that they're building the capital there actually suggests that they might actually start investing in the interior finally.
Didn't Brazil do that at some point?
They did. Their original capital was Rio de Janeiro, I think. And then they built a new capital in the 20th century in the interior, Brasilia. Yeah, they did not build it in the Amazon. They actually built it, I think, in the Cerrado, if I'm not mistaken. Don't know if we have any Brazilians in chat, but please correct me on that. The Cerrado is kind of this big savanna biome, and it kind of straddles eastern and southern Brazil. It's a very large region. It's a large biome. It is one of the dominant characteristics of Brazil, but nobody's ever heard of it because it's overshadowed by the Amazon. But you are correct. They did build a new capital in the interior for reasons that are kind of similar. Well, probably not similar, actually. I suspect Equatorial Guinea is probably rebuilding their capital mostly just for money, just opportunities to steal more shit from the public purse. I'm not aware of any political transition there, so I don't imagine the government right now is any less craven than it's ever been in that regard. But in Brazil's case, part of the impetus to relocate the capital was they wanted the capital to be closer to people. A lot of state capitals in the United States are located where they are basically so that it's roughly equidistant from every part of the state. That's not really a big issue now in an era with rapid transportation, but a couple hundred years ago, having a state capital that was relatively close was actually very useful for people. You know, if it was on the other side of the state from you, then that could be very, very inconvenient and represented a barrier to entry for you in politics. So having a capital that was well located was actually important. And so similarly so in Brazil, Rio de Janeiro is not very close to the territories in the interior that had, you know, a rapidly growing population in the early mid-20th century. So relocating the capital to a location more in the interior was more fair, basically, to that interior population. Made it less difficult for them to travel to the capital than had been the case previously.
Oh, we have a chatter who's living in Rio de Janeiro now who's listening. They said, "What the fuck? I'm living there." Welcome. Tell us something about what your people in your city care about. What is the current issue for you? I would like to go to Brazil. It seems interesting. Cool kind of melting pot of cultures between Latin culture, Portuguese, and native, and others.
African.
Yeah, African. I would imagine they have really good food too. I feel like most countries have figured out good food. There are a few exceptions, but
England. Yeah, a couple others.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, Brazil has a really cool culture. It really is its own thing. Americans kind of make the mistake of lumping them in with Spanish America, but that's really not a world they're part of. To the point where I've read that people in Brazil don't consider themselves Latinos.
Huh.
That's more a term they associate with Spanish-speaking America.
Yeah,
Am I
interesting.
remembering this correctly? It was Latinos, wasn't it? I might be mixing up terms. Well, regardless, they don't see themselves as part of Spanish-speaking America. That's one half of the continent that has its own culture, and then they have their own culture, which is separate. They have a lot in common. It's not like there's no overlap at all, but American notions of the region being just basically one giant Mexico are very, very incorrect.
To quote a Twitch chatter, them Brazilian baddies do be wildin'. Which I had to get some translation on what all those terms mean.
Yeah, Brazilian women are known for being very sexy.
A baddie would be an attractive woman, and then wildin' would be you are in a very attractive state, taking good care of yourself. You are hot. It's like, okay,
Well,
I didn't know those things.
That's one definition. I'd always associated the term wilding with going crazy, crashing out, partying, something like that. Getting into trouble.
I see.
It's a fairly versatile term.
Oh, wilding means being out of control. Okay, I'm being corrected. Thank you.
There you go. I think it was a term more popular in the northeastern U.S. in late 80s, early 90s, but it's kind of fallen out of use since then. Yeah, Brazil is a big country to the point where there are significant regional differences. So while it does have like a national culture, there can be some significant variance depending on where you are. Like the northeastern part of Brazil actually has a lot in common with the American South. History of plantations, lots of slavery, unfortunately. Significant African American technically fits. Significant African American population. Also much poorer than the rest of the country. More issues with corruption. Yeah, the American South. Pretty much the same thing in many ways. You know, the southern part of Brazil kind of is a little more economically developed, more modern. Not that it necessarily matters, but it is whiter than the rest of Brazil as well. There was much more European emigration there than in other parts of the country because that's where the cities were, that's where the factories were, etc. So, you know, Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo.
And Brazil is
Yeah,
a
I don't
pretty
know.
big population too. They're the largest population in South America.
Oh, yeah. I think Brazil's population represents about half the population of the entire South American continent.
Whoa.
Yeah, they're pretty much the regional hegemon.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting
But
because are they the only Portuguese-speaking country as their primary?
in South America,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I believe so.
Hmm.
Well, the Portuguese Empire in the Americas didn't get broken up like the Spanish Empire did. It stayed a cohesive whole. Understandably so. Basically, Portugal was punching way above its weight when it got Brazil. They didn't actually value it that much at first because there wasn't like gold or a lot of valuable natural resources. So it kind of took a little longer for their colonization of Brazil to really pick up. But when it did, Brazil very rapidly became like much wealthier and nicer than Portugal itself, to the point where it was kind of a very awkward imbalance of power between metropole and colony. Yeah, during the Napoleonic Wars, the Portuguese royal family actually just picked up and relocated fully to Brazil.
Huh. Interesting. Is that for self-preservation or just because it was nicer?
Both. Yeah. The Napoleonic Wars made Portugal kind of dangerous, and it was just genuinely nicer. Like it's a very, given the climate and whatnot, like yeah, it's a great place to live. Some parts more than others, but like in general, it's an improvement. And I think it wasn't too long after that, after the Napoleonic Wars ended, that the prince of the royal family, who was nominally in charge of Brazil while his father was in Portugal, just decided to declare independence. Said, fuck it, I don't want to be king of Portugal. I'd rather just be emperor of Brazil. Thus was born independent Brazil. They did not achieve independence out of a revolution fighting for a republic like other countries in the Americas did. I think they're maybe the only one that actually did the opposite. Yeah, I think Brazilians still participated in the Portuguese Empire even after that. I think I've read that a lot of the Portuguese traders in Angola, for example, were actually disproportionately Brazilian. Yeah, neat place. Doesn't get enough attention.
The land is pretty fertile, right? So they can support quite a bit of agriculture.
Kind of. Kind of. The northeastern coast was pretty good for sugar, I think. I think that was the main one for a long time. And then in the southern part, well, specifically southeastern Brazil, I think their big thing is coffee. So relatively fertile in those places. But when you get into the interior, then it gets a little more dicey because the Cerrado is actually very dry. And the Amazon rainforest technically is fertile, but it's also like very thick jungle, and it doesn't have very good infrastructure.
Yeah, it's so
So that
dense
makes
that
it,
you have to like clear a bunch of trees to actually plant crops.
yeah, and actually a lot of people don't even bother with the crops. A lot of people who move into Brazil, move into the rainforest usually end up just clearing the land and using it to graze cattle. The Cerrado, though, does have significant agricultural production, but it's heavily subsidized. They have to use a lot of fertilizer. They need a lot of money from the government, et cetera, in order to make that work. It does work well. I think the Cerrado produces a huge chunk of Brazil's soybean crop, for example. But it's not really an intuitive location for agriculture. They did have to do a lot of work to make that possible. So yes, there's a lot of fertile land in Brazil, but it's more along the coast. The further inland you go, the more difficult it kind of becomes, at least outside of the Amazon. The Amazon just has its own problems. The Amazon rainforest is kind of a weird entity. just in terms of Brazil as a whole. Because you look at a map and the Amazon rainforest kind of dominates Brazil as a country. It's like the main geographic feature. But that's not where most of the people live. That's not where most of the economic activity happens. That's not where most of the infrastructure is. So Brazil as a country really is the part of Brazil outside of the Amazon rainforest. Like that's where all the action happens. And then the Amazon rainforest is more just awkwardly attached to that country. That's not to say there's not people in the Amazon. It's just a very small fraction of the country's overall population. Have you ever heard of Manaus?
Manaus. Don't know.
Yeah, that's the largest city in the Amazon rainforest. It's actually a port city astride the Amazon River.
Huh.
Yeah, if you ever want to experience what it was like to live on the American frontier, like in a frontier town or city, consider going to Manaus, because that's probably as close as you're going to get in the modern world. It technically is connected to the rest of Brazil by road, but it's like a small 2-lane dirt road that cuts through the Amazon rainforest. It's a very tenuous link at best. I think most of the cargo that comes to the city comes via either air or by the Amazon River. So if you're in Manaus, you're kind of isolated. You're not completely cut off from the rest of the world, but you are very far from it. How are we doing on time?
I'm going for 2 hours 20.
Gotcha. Oh, I can see the flags again.
Yeah.
Got 2 from India.
Nice.
Yeah, we don't. I guess I haven't really paid attention to the flags too much, but I don't think we've traditionally had too many Indian viewers.
Maki is one of them. We play Dota with her a lot.
Oh, cool.
There's also a pro/semi-pro Zerg player named Demi who's from India. India is kind of far from a lot of the servers, so they get pretty bad ping. So any Indian gamers are usually very good at playing with lag.
Really?
Yeah. Kind of like South African gamers as well.
Huh.
Because you've got, like, if you're thinking gaming community server locations, it's Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, United States. And then in South America, they've got usually a Brazil server of some kind, and then Peru is pretty big in gaming. So India is pretty far from all of those. South Africa also very far from all of those.
What about Australia?
Australia usually gets their own. They usually have their own server. Yeah.
Gotcha. I was going to say South Africa, India, Australia, you're basically talking about the British Empire and the Indian Ocean.
Which is pretty far from the UK.
Yeah. Well, maybe they can blame their lag on the British Empire then.
Yeah.
I can't think of any reason why that would be the case, but there does seem to be some correlation there.
Mm-hmm. If y'all set up better lasting infrastructure and invested in the local community, then we would have better internet and better gaming.
Got one in Nepal.
Nice.
Did we talk about Bangladesh at all?
I think in the past couple of weeks something was mentioned, but I can't remember what it was. Do they have a...
I meant today. Did I talk about it?
No.
No, okay. They did have that election.
Mm-hmm.
That had been planned for like a year a year plus after the previous government was overthrown. And it pretty much played out as I expected. The protesters, especially the students, formed their own party, and they just got clobbered. They won, I think, 16 seats out of what, more than 100. So very, very meager returns for them. Meanwhile, the BNP, which was the main establishment party running, is going to form the next government. They won a majority. Once you include all of their coalition partners, anyway. So, on the one hand, it is good that they held the election, but having the BNP win it means that the whole revolution was kind of a lateral move. Because while they might be somewhat better than the Awami League, it's pretty much going to be the same shit. The BNP had been in power before the Awami League basically seized control of the country. And when they pretty much just did all of the same corrupt shit the Awami League did. So I don't really see any reason not to expect any different this time. So another example of the youth successfully protesting and achieving some degree of change, only to see the aftermath result in a return to power by establishment actors of one kind or another.
Who is it? It was like Paul Ryan, I think, an American senator who was admitting like it's a lot easier to be an opposition representative than an establishment one, where you're trying to actually make policy.
Yeah.
He said it in a fit of frustration. I think they're trying to do their own like healthcare bill kind of thing during maybe Trump's first term, was it? I can't remember exactly when it was, but yeah, it's a lot easier to generally resist something and force a change than it is to enact a new change or a new set of norms. That's much harder to do.
Unfortunately so.
I was telling my parents that the early United States was that way, where the different regions of the colonies have very different economies, very different goals. Some of them are aggressively Protestant, some of them are aggressively Catholic, some of them are Quakers, some of them are Jewish, whatever. Like, they have a lot of different religious and cultural and economic drivers, and they all want the crown off of them. So they have that seminal moment where they say, okay, we're going to be the United States of America, but should we have slavery or not? Should we have this or not? Like, they weren't unified on all those different things. And like you were mentioning, the states had a lot more power back then relative to the federal government. So they were a lot more discrete entities, different from each other.
I think we did have some more questions here.
Far away.
What are your thoughts on the new U.S. Health Secretary, RFK Jr., and his approach to a broad range of policies, such as diet, autism, passing mention to distinguish profound autism, if you know about this, and such things? I'm not super invested. Well, let me rephrase that. I'm not super familiar with the public policy of healthcare. I know more about private healthcare systems in the United States, but as for actual individual health issues, I'm not really familiar enough with those to comment on them intelligently. So I've kind of learned that the hard way, in the same way that I learned that I really should not comment too much on the law. That's not really my bag. I don't have the background for it. So I'm not really in a position to critique RFK Jr. very well, because the individual things he does as health secretary are kind of beyond my remit. I've certainly read a lot of criticism of him and the things he's done, but I can't judge the substance of those criticisms without really knowing more about the underlying science, basically, of what they're doing.
My impression, just from the things that I've seen and the people I've talked to, are anyone who's like anti-pharma tends to like him because he contests a lot of the norms, I guess, in that front. But people who are like medical professionals or very scientific, we'll see a lot of his stuff as maybe pseudoscience that he might push in terms of like personal health priorities, and there may be a little bit more conspiracy mixed in there. But like Agent Smith, I as well am not a doctor, so when it comes to like health issues, it would depend on which one he's talking about, because for as broad of a category as that is, for whoever you put in that position, they're going to have some ideas right and some ideas wrong. Is he better than the previous healthcare administrator person? I don't really remember. Who was the previous one? Were they good?
I don't know the name off the top of my head. That's probably because they were very boring.
Yeah.
And didn't try to completely upend the agency they were leading.
Yep. Status quo.
That's what happens when you have bureaucrats just doing normal bureaucrat things. They tend to fade into the background. Yeah, I don't especially trust him. I think we've got some guys in chat who do like him, and they've kind of gone to bat for him a couple times when we've talked about this before. So I don't want to completely throw him under the bus unfairly when I don't really have a strong background in health issues of one kind or another. But I did not have a positive impression of him during the Trump campaign, before Trump won the presidency. Some of the things he said were a little too conspiracy-brained for me. I have seen him do some things vis-a-vis the CDC, such as kind of dropping the ball on health alerts. I think that was one criticism I've read. They didn't really issue a health alert for the flu season outbreak, which was apparently pretty bad last year. Also, he's not really doing much about the measles outbreak, which is apparently a thing. Very frustrating to read about measles in the United States in the 21st century. That really should not be a thing.
Yeah, I thought we mostly eliminated that one.
Well, we did, and now it's back. And some of the people who have kind of led the way on bringing it back are kind of associated with RFK Jr., so that's part of the reason for my skepticism.
That's anti-vax stuff, I would guess.
Yeah, that's part of it. But without being able to articulate beyond that, I'm not going to go after him too hard here. I will say, even without being able to comment intelligently on individual health issues, I have noted that there are a lot of people who are much, much more skeptical about the CDC and the federal government generally vis-a-vis health issues, specifically on the political left. That's probably just going to get worse as we continue on through the Trump administration here and his second term. So that'll probably have some consequences. We've already seen what the consequences were when the vaxxers lost confidence in the government and the healthcare establishment. I'm sure we'll have equally colorful consequences from an even broader swath of the public losing confidence in institutions of government. But that remains to be seen. That's in the future for now. Something to look forward to. Do you have an opinion / facts on Hitler's death? I'm generally for the death of Hitler. I'm not sure what opinion I could have on it. I personally think he made it out of Germany and escaped to Brazil. Brazil has a German quarter, for example. Okay, I see. All right. Do I have an opinion on whether or not Hitler is actually survived World War II and then went to South America? I don't think so. I think evidence came out after the end of the Cold War that the Soviets actually did find his burned body and just buried it somewhere. I don't remember if that was ever fully verified, but I do remember reading about that. So I guess if I have an opinion on it, my opinion, based off of what I understand about that, is that he did die. in the bunker.
He died of death until he
It,
was dead.
I think it was a poison and a self-inflicted gunshot wound, if I'm not mistaken. I think Ava Brown was with him and did the same thing. And then some of his followers burned his body after the fact and then buried it, and then the Soviets found it, dug it up, and then buried it someplace else. Yeah, I don't think Brazil or Argentina ended up hosting Hitler after the war. For one, I doubt he could remain quiet long enough not to be caught. He was kind of known for being a loudmouth, so probably, even if he did survive, it would have just been a matter of time before he ran his mouth and ended up getting caught.
I feel like there was a movie about that. I think that's the premise of some like sci-fi games and alternate history stuff where it's like, if the Nazis won, what would have happened to the US, what would have happened here and there. And then there's some people who kind of like believing in Elvis still being alive. They'll still just like feel like there wasn't enough evidence to super confirm that that happened, so they're gonna still believe.
Did you ever see the one about cloning Hitler?
No.
Yeah, so apparently this was a movie. So the movie's premise is that some Nazi scientists were able to clone Hitler. And when I say clone, basically I mean they were able to replicate his DNA in an embryo. I don't remember the details exactly. But they transferred the embryos to some women in different parts of the world at the end of the war, because they wanted to basically raise a new Hitler who could lead the Nazis again in the future. And so the movie takes place a couple decades later. I don't remember exactly what the time frame was, but the kids were growing up. They were teenagers, I think. And what was it? Somebody found out about it and was killing the kids, or the kids were killing people. I don't remember exactly, but the whole thing was utterly bizarre. So yes, there's definitely been a lot of movies made about some variation of Hitler surviving or getting cloned or whatever the fuck. It's always some crazy shit. Let's see. I've seen summations of the proposed changes in tax code in the Netherlands to tax unrealized capital gains for stocks. What are the probable effects for the country, especially when it comes to strategically important companies where the executives may not want to deal with it, like ASML and NXP? Taxing unrealized capital gains for stocks. That's definitely a bold move. Even if you do tax them, generally it's realized gains, right? I imagine, given that it's the Netherlands, that they'll do it in a smart way. The Dutch are generally pretty good about things like that. So I imagine they're not going to just do full-on taxation of unrealized capital gains. They're probably going to narrow it down to specific types of stocks, and they'll probably limit the amount of the tax. So it won't be like 5-10%, whatever. It'll probably be a sliding scale where it's like, if it's above 5% growth in the stock, or not stock, if the gain is around 5%, then the tax might be like 1%, 0.5%. And then as the gain increases, if it's higher, then the tax increases. I would expect something like that. I'm speaking purely hypothetically here, because I'm not familiar with the bill in question. But I would guess that there's going to be lots of negotiations that go into the formation of that if they actually do implement it, and that the final product will not be just like a full tax on unrealized capital gains. That would be pretty dramatic if they did do that, which is exactly why I imagine it won't happen. Yeah, taxing capital gains for stocks, but if not just capital gains generally, is controversial because it basically reduces the return on investment for whatever it is being taxed. And that dramatically shifts a lot of the calculus that goes into investing. Like if you can invest in stocks and bonds or whatever and get a 10% return, that's an attractive investment. But if there's a capital gains tax, then you have to estimate the impact of the tax when you're trying to compare alternative possible investments. So maybe if the capital gains tax is too high, it's not worth it to invest in stocks and bonds at all. And it's better to just stick it in something else. So there's a distortionary effect there in that case. And the distortion then could result in financial markets that are less liquid. It could result in angel investment becoming more rare, basically just less dynamic investment environment generally, such that you end up with less economic growth. So it has potentially dramatic impacts in that vein. That doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't do it. It just means that if you do it, you need to keep all of this in mind. You need to work around that and not just ignore it. If you ignore it, you're definitely going to have problems. So it's a very sensitive subject. Generally, whenever it's brought up, it gets a lot of pushback in the United States in particular, because there's a lot of super wealthy people that basically live off of the interest on their investments. And taxing capital gains is tantamount to taxing just their income, because that capital gains effectively is their income. So they especially hate the idea of capital gains taxes. Given how influential they are in American politics, that's probably why it's almost certainly never going to happen here. But it is brought up more in other places, generally places without strong financial sectors. It's no coincidence. Financial firms definitely prefer jurisdictions where there is not a significant capital gains tax. But yeah, without knowing more about the details of the tax proposed, I'm a little hesitant to commit too much to it. Maybe they're being dumb. That could totally be the case. Maybe they are just going to heavily tax their financial sector and then create major disruptions for their overarching economy by doing so. That's a possible outcome if they are going to be dumb about it. In which case you could see some capital flight out of the Netherlands. I don't know if individual firms would actually leave over that, like ASML and XP and whatnot, because their main thing is profits, right? So long as they're turning a decent profit in the Netherlands, they don't really have much incentive to leave. People owning their stock might have less incentive to own the stock, but in that case, they could just delist in the Netherlands and list somewhere else, like the New York Stock Exchange or Hong Kong, like wherever, and then they can kind of get around it. And I imagine that the tax is more for Dutch citizens. So if you're a foreigner holding stock in ASML or what was it, NXP, you may not be impacted by this at all, depending again on how the law is written, which again, I don't know. So lots of ifs, ands, or buts there in terms of what impact it will have. It really depends on the details of implementation. Well, that's all we had for questions, at least for the moment. I think I did have some weird news somewhere. I did. Sub-Saharan Africa. Oh, I guess it's both Zambia related, weirdly enough. So there was a big kerfuffle on Zambia's internet. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. There was a big kerfuffle online in Zambia. Let's put it like that. It had to do with comments that were made by Zambia's president. So what happened is that there was an official, not an official, the president of Ghana visited Zambia, and when he came, he was wearing a traditional outfit that was called fugu. I'm almost certainly mispronouncing that, so I apologize. And some people online mocked him for that, saying that it looked like a blouse. And there was a big backlash to that, specifically by one popular YouTuber in Ghana criticized them, saying that it was not a blouse and that the president was trying to promote the local garment industry, local culture, etc. And the reason this is in my notes at all is just because of this quote. So this YouTuber said, quote, "It is unfortunate that many of you, despite having access to smartphones and the internet, still choose to remain ignorant," unquote. As true in this case as it is in many, many others. Unfortunately, unfortunately, Africa is not immune to people being dumb on the internet. This is just the latest evidence. There was an even weirder story that happened a little bit later. This had to do with a man who was fishing with some friends. At one point, because this is Zambia, right, wildlife is very prominent, especially out in the country, and they actually still have megafauna. So this guy was fishing with his friends, but while they were fishing, they spooked some elephants, which caused the herd to charge. Uh-oh. Which is a problem, because elephants can definitely fuck you up. So this guy dove into a river to escape. Oh. Whereupon he was attacked by a crocodile.
Ah, shit. Out of the frying pan into the fire. Damn.
Exactly. So the crocodile grabs his leg, but he fights it off with an oar. He successfully gets his leg out of the crocodile's mouth and escapes, whereupon his friends were able to drag him off. Unfortunately, he did not survive. He died from blood loss from the wound to his leg caused by the crocodile.
Damn.
Yeah. But that's one hell of a sequence of events.
Yeah.
Going from fishing to running from elephants to fighting a crocodile. Wow.
Yeah. Tough day at the office.
Really. Let's see, that's all we had for questions. I'm out of news, including weird news. I'll have to restock that later. So we might just wrap up early if we don't have anything else we want to get to.
Sure. Is there anything you've been gaming or watching lately?
Midnight Suns. I don't know if you've heard of that.
Midnight Suns.
Yeah, it's actually... God, how do you describe it? It's like a tactical RPG card game. Mm-hmm. It's a lot of things. It tries to be a lot of things. But it actually does kind of succeed. The core gameplay loop is fun. I'll say that for it. I have been enjoying it. The story is a little bland, but that's fine. I can forgive that. It's actually a Marvel game. It's got the Avengers and a couple X-Men, a couple other sort of C-list heroes that I kind of hadn't thought about in a long time.
Nice.
Yeah, it's pretty neat. Weirdly enough, it's made by 4K, specifically Firaxis, which is the same company that makes Civ games. Yeah, I would not have thought that they would make a game like Midnight Suns, but apparently they got the chance at some point. So that's been pretty fun.
Nice.
Disco Elysium is fantastic. I haven't gotten back to that in a while. Kind of got distracted. Haven't really been watching anything though. I generally just get streaming services for a month and then just cancel them. Do that maybe once or twice a year.
Streaming
really
service
have really
companies
access.
hate him. Agent Smith. Maximizing his value for minimal cost.
Yeah, so I can't say I've been really watching anything consistently.
Yeah, in terms of efficiency of browsing through the content, that's a way to min-max it, because you're not spending any additional time on stuff. You're basically getting access to the whole library, taking everything that you want, and then closing the door until they come up with something else.
Yeah. Yeah, if I had more money, I might do otherwise, but I don't. C'est la vie. Yeah, I guess the main other thing I've been doing is taking care of that relative who was hurt. I'm still doing that.
Gotcha. Good on you.
Apparently, a rat was nesting in their truck.
A what was?
A rat.
Oh, a rat.
Yeah, the truck smelled very bad when driving in it.
Mm-hmm.
And there were some other minor issues with the electronics, and it turned out that a rat had chewed through some of the wires in the engine.
Oh, damn.
Yeah. So that was doing some damage to the electronics, and it was causing the smell. Mystery solved.
Yeah, there are some cables in vehicles that they coat with soy. It's, I think, Japanese brands especially. It's just a way to protect the wiring. But if you have one of those vehicles out here in the country, then the wildlife will find the soy and eat it as food for them, which will damage the vehicle.
Hmm.
Yep.
Really?
Yep. My brother had to change vehicles as a result of that.
Damn.
Yep.
Have you been to any hockey games recently?
I did see the Rapid City Rush that one time, fairly recently. She told me it's not exactly the league directly below the NHL, but it's kind of like that.
Yeah, the ECHL.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember the city of Allen down here near Dallas?
Yes.
They have a team in the ECHL.
Ah, I didn't know that.
Yeah, the Allen Americans. That's the last Texas team. Very sad. Yeah, I think I told you before, the ECHL is actually the result of multiple leagues merging together.
Mm-hmm.
One of the predecessor leagues was the Western Professional Hockey League, and they had something like a dozen plus teams in Texas at one point. And now they're all gone. They've been around for 10, 15 years, and they all just kind of went under after the Great Recession.
The Great Recession was what?
The Great Recession is why they disappeared. They had just stopped making money, couldn't borrow money, and so they all folded.
Hmm. Yeah, I was asking what was the Great Recession? It's not the Great Depression.
Oh, 2008 financial crisis.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah, there's not really like a single unified name for it. Great Recession, 2008 financial crisis. I've heard a couple. Those are the two main ones I use.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we should probably get better at naming things. We used to have really cool names for historical events. We don't really have them anymore. Have you ever heard of the Mississippi Shatter Zone?
No, but that sounds cool. What is that?
Right? It's memorable. It's a good name for something.
Yeah.
All right, so the Mississippi Shatter Zone is a region in the southeastern United States that used to be encompassed by the Mississippi Mound culture. Basically, I don't think that's quite the correct name. I don't remember off the top of my head, but they were the mound builders. You know, we have these big mounds that were built up and were the centers of big towns and cities that this culture had constructed in its prime. And something happened to them. And from what I've been reading, historians haven't really been able to figure out what. They really kind of first emerged around the year 900 AD, and then sometime in the mid 1400s, they started to disappear to the point where there was barely anything left of them by the time the Spanish arrived. And then, of course, by the time the first English colonists arrived around 1600, they were mostly gone. So the shatter zone is the zone that they used to live in, but which over the course of the 1400s and 1500s was slowly reduced by a combination of disease and slave raiding. Now, mind you, the disease and slave raiding is actually after their civilization declined. We still don't know why that happened. But in the wake of that decline, when people were moving away from their cities into more rural areas and living more off the land, well, I guess they'd always lived off the land, but living non-urban lifestyles, semi-nomadic, I think is the proper term. As people started doing that more, then the Spanish came. And that, of course, introduced a disease which absolutely devastated the population. So in addition to the decline of urban civilization, there was a further demographic decline from diseases. And once the English arrived in the early 1600s, they started slave raiding regularly in the region, and that further dramatically reduced the population. So Shatter Zone refers to this broader region of just devastation, just multiple apocalyptic events kind of cascading on top of each other and reducing the population to the point where it was relatively thinly populated and where there was very little in the way of built-up urban areas. So that's the Mississippi Shatter Zone. Easy to remember.
Yeah, very flashy name.
Yeah, I've been reading about it in the past couple of weeks as part of that early 19th century research. It's specifically because that area was so hollowed out from all of those factors that it was relatively easy for the United States to expand into that area against native resistance. There was just hardly anything there anymore. And the weird thing is that wasn't even the only region in North America like that. The Ohio Valley was very similar. It was pretty much depopulated for much the same reason, but from slightly different vectors, basically.
Oh, cool.
You mentioned Equatorial Guinea earlier. One of the things that they were in the news for, what was it? I think during the first Trump administration, actually. The first term of the Trump administration, I need to figure out the proper grammar for that. Like 10 years ago, roughly, Equatorial Guinea was briefly in the news because there was a rumor that had been leaked from the US government that the Chinese government was in talks with Equatorial Guinea to host a Chinese naval base. And that led to not inconsiderable hand-wringing in Washington, because, of course, a Chinese naval base on the Atlantic would be a major shift in the strategic balance of power in the Atlantic. Even if it was just one base, like having to plan around that would be a major departure for the US Navy. So the US government launched a whole diplomatic offensive to try to charm the Equatorial Guinea government and also kind of to threaten them a little bit, as is Washington's want, and to try to give them lots of reasons not to host a Chinese naval base. I don't think it was ever fully confirmed whether or not that was a real possibility. But it made the rounds, and the US government definitely was acting like it was. And so the result is that the Equatorial Guinea government got lots of goodies from Washington, whereas previously Washington had barely paid attention to them.
Today we learned. Yeah, African news is notoriously absent from our usual news cycle, which I think also plays into the notion of us not having much policy or involvement there.
Given the nature of American involvement these days, that's probably for the best.
Yeah, yeah, fair point.
Did you win?
I did not win, but we actually confirmed a stream snipe, which is pretty funny. I executed a maneuver where I dropped their main base, and it felt sus that they had their whole army standing there ready because they had no information that I was going to go for that drop, but they clicked their whole army to the back corner of their own main base, and there's no reason to go there except to drop this or to block the specific drop that I went for. All of their shit, they just run it right to where I'm going, and there's nothing on the mini map that shows me at all. That's pretty crazy. That's funny. I would almost rather lose to this and then have the evidence against a player that they're an ill actor just because it's dank. Like, this is content. That was a decision. That was a decision to use
Some
that
people.
advantage. Their whole army is there. That's really funny. Wow. Nice. Yeah, I get to levy a report. I almost never get to report people in StarCraft. You report people in Dota like every game. There's usually one bad apple in almost every Dota game. Maybe not, but close to that. But in SC2, you have good actors almost always across the board. That's pretty funny.
Well, I'm glad it's at least rare.
Yeah. Very nice. Well, cool.
Is that it for tonight?
Yeah, I believe so. Were there any of the countries that you wanted to comment on or ask chat about? Because you said you hadn't looked at the flags in a bit.
Yeah, nothing's jumping out at me. I think the ones I was most interested in I already talked about.
Gotcha.
Poland is always fun. And I guess I would ask how the new government is doing.
When did they get their new government?
Like a year ago. I guess it's not all that new in the grand scheme of things, but yeah, 1 year or so is still relatively new to me. That's a short enough time that I could forget they exist and still think the previous government is still in power.
We have a Polish StarCraft pro, Elaser, who plays Dota with us.
Oh, yeah.
Very strong gamer, yep.
Nice. Poland has a pretty cool history. Very dramatic.
Yeah, they're one of those countries that's kind of in the area between the East and the West, so between Russia and the rest of continental Europe, but they have a legacy of their own for sure.
Yeah, they kind of came back from the brink. They literally were not on the map for a long time. That's quite the comeback story.
How long were they off the map?
Well, let's see. I think the last partition of Poland was, what was it, 16-7? No, not 16, 17 something, 1770s. Would have been like late 1700s, thereabouts. So from then until 1918, I want to say. So that's 120, 30, about 140 years, let's say.
A 140?
Sorry, what?
140, you said?
Yeah. Yeah, thereabouts. And before that, they had actually been a regional hegemon. They'd been one of the most powerful, influential countries in Eastern Europe. But due to internal discord, basically, they suffered a precipitous decline over the course of the 1600s in particular. So by the time by the 1700s, they were not in a good spot, and their neighbors found it very easy to basically just divide their territory between them. So then, yeah, they weren't a country for more than a century, and they suffered multiple attempts to try to destroy their culture and assimilate them into the cultures of their neighbors. And then World War I happens, and they get the country back out of thin air, basically. And from there, they rebuilt, and now they're a thing again.
That's pretty cool. Well, they had a continuous language the whole time. So
They did, but it was under severe pressure. Russians, in particular, were trying to stop them from using it and get them to speak exclusively Russian. I think there were similar assimilation efforts in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the German Empire. But they hung on. They ended up making it through.
good job, Poland. Yeah, and their pain and suffering has contributed to the creation of some of the best art in modern black metal. Poland is considered maybe one of the top 3 countries or so in terms of that metal genre. Used to be
Really?
mainly Norway, Sweden, Denmark, like the Scandinavian countries, Finland as well.
Yeah.
They're into metal stuff, but Poland is very strong now. They have some of
Wow.
the biggest metal bands. Behemoth, Muglaw is pretty big. Chad may know of some others, but yeah, they're very strong. Very strong music scene.
Interesting.
And pretty strong gaming scene too. Good job, Poland. Well, cool.
Well,
Thank you, chat, for your contributions. Thank you, Fuzzy Gold, for lending questions. And Agent Smith, for your time. We'll see you on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
yeah, talk to you next time. Thanks again. Always a privilege.
GG.
Totally got that backwards.
That's okay. You got to mix it up sometimes.